My name is Jackin, and if you had told me even a year ago that I would be standing in the private dining hall of Alexander Maxwell, the man people whispered about as one of the richest and most untouchable men alive, I would have laughed in your face. My life was not glamorous, not shiny, not even close. It was messy, ordinary, and often painfully small. I was the kind of woman who worked long hours just to keep the lights on, who counted coins at the bottom of my bag to afford the bus, who smiled through exhaustion at customers because I needed every tip to survive. My world was gray and predictable, and sometimes I thought it would swallow me whole. But then, as it always happens in stories that feel too big to be real, something shifted, something cracked open, and I found myself swept into a current so strong I couldn't resist. That is how I ended up there, in that room, with Alexander's piercing eyes locked on mine, the weight of secrets pressing on my chest, and the terrifying awareness that nothing in my life would ever be the same again. I still remember the first time I heard his name spoken not as a rumor but as a possibility. A friend at the diner, someone who had a cousin working in the outer offices of one of his companies, leaned across the counter and whispered, "You know, he isn't as untouchable as people think. He's looking for someone real." I laughed at that, brushed it off like gossip, but the seed was planted. I went home that night and sat in my tiny apartment staring at the peeling paint on the walls, wondering what it would feel like to be seen by a man like him, to step out of the shadows of my invisible life. That wondering turned into a reckless impulse, and that impulse into action, and before I knew it, I was walking down a marble hallway toward doors taller than any I had ever seen, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might break through my ribs. When the doors opened, the sight stole my breath. The dining hall was drenched in golden light, chandeliers glittering like frozen rain, a table stretching longer than my entire apartment. And at the head of it, there he was, Alexander Maxwell. His presence filled the space in a way that words can't capture. He was not just a man, he was a force, his eyes sharp, his posture perfect, the kind of presence that made everyone else seem to shrink. And yet when his gaze met mine, I didn't feel small. I felt exposed, like he could see every part of me I tried to hide, and for some reason, he didn't look away. "Jackin," he said my name as though it belonged to him already, as though he had been waiting. My throat tightened, my palms damp, but I forced a smile and whispered back, "Mr. Maxwell." That was the beginning, the moment the world tilted and I began walking a path lined with both promises and shadows. Of course, I didn't know then what I know now. I didn't know that every smile hid a question, every glance carried weight, every promise carried chains. All I knew in that instant was the dizzying thrill of being noticed, of being chosen, of stepping into a story larger than anything my life had prepared me for. The dinner that night was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Food I couldn't name was placed before me on porcelain plates, wine poured that shimmered like jewels in crystal glasses. Around the table sat men and women who looked like they belonged to another species, draped in wealth, their laughter soft and practiced, their words threaded with power. I should have felt out of place, I should have crumbled under the weight of my insignificance, but every time my nerves threatened to overwhelm me, I felt Alexander's gaze anchor me, pulling me back, holding me steadied. I told myself then that maybe this was fate, maybe this was the moment all my hardships had been leading to. But deep down, a smaller, quieter voice whispered that nothing comes without cost, and I would one day pay more than I could imagine. That first night was a blur of taste, sound, and sensation, but one detail has never left me, the way Alexander leaned close near the end of the meal, his voice low, almost tender, as he said, "You don't belong in the shadows, Jackin. Stay close to me, and you'll see what the world truly looks like." Those words wrapped around me like a spell, and I believed them, because I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe in a future brighter than the dim lights of my small apartment, brighter than the hopeless grind of survival, and so I stayed. But what I didn't understand yet was that stepping into his world meant stepping into a maze of lies, loyalty, and betrayal so tangled it would take everything I had to survive it. In the days that followed that first dinner, my life changed in ways I could not have prepared for, because suddenly I was no longer just Jackin, the girl who worked double shifts at a diner. I was Jackin who received phone calls from men in black suits with clipped voices saying that a car would arrive at 7 to take me to an address I had never heard of. Jackin who walked past velvet ropes into places I had only seen on magazine covers. Jackin who felt the brush of expensive fabric. against her skin because suddenly I was dressed in clothes I could never afford, clothes that arrived in boxes at my door as though someone had studied every inch of me and decided what I should look like. At first it felt like a dream, a glittering world of chandeliers and whispered conversations where Alexander always stood at the center, a man around whom everything orbited, and somehow he had pulled me into that orbit. He was attentive in a way that was unnerving, his eyes always searching my face, as though measuring me, testing me, weighing if I could hold the weight of the world he was offering. And I, foolish or maybe just hungry for more, told myself I could. I remember one evening when he took me to a gallery opening, the kind where champagne flowed like water and every painting cost more than I would make in a decade, and I was so overwhelmed that I nearly fled. But Alexander noticed. He leaned close, his hand brushing against mine in a gesture that seemed casual but felt deliberate, and he whispered, "Breathe, Jackin. You are not an intruder here. You are mine, and that means you belong." The words both soothed and unsettled me, because part of me wanted to melt into the comfort of belonging, but another part recoiled at the thought of being claimed like an object. Still, I stayed by his side, because the warmth of his presence drowned out the warnings in my chest, but beneath the glitter there were cracks. Sometimes when I asked simple questions about his past, about where he had come from, about why he trusted me when he could have anyone, his expression would harden, the warmth draining from his eyes, and he would change the subject with a precision that felt practiced. Other times I would hear whispers from people around him, mentions of alliances, betrayals, sums of money exchanged in ways that didn't feel clean. Once, late at night, I wandered into a study lined with books and papers and caught a glimpse of documents scattered across his desk, numbers, transactions, names I didn't recognize, and when he walked in behind me the way his voice cut through the silence made my skin crawl. "Curiosity is dangerous, Jackin," he said softly, but there was steel under the softness, a warning that wrapped around my throat like invisible hands. I laughed it off, made some joke about being nosy, but the truth is my hand shook long after I left the room. Despite the unease, I kept going back. Because the pull of him was undeniable, because the taste of that world was addictive, because for the first time in my life people looked at me as though I mattered. I told myself that the shadows I glimpsed were just in my head, that the unease was only because I wasn't used to wealth and power. I told myself that Alexander's secrets were his own and didn't concern me. But late at night, when I lay in a bed softer than any I had ever known, I sometimes woke with a start, heart pounding, certain I had heard a voice outside the door, certain that someone was watching even when I was alone, and yet, every morning when I saw him again, when he smiled that rare, disarming smile that made the air crackle, I silenced the doubts. Because I wanted to believe in the fantasy, I wanted to believe that a man like Alexander could see me, choose me, love me. What I didn't know then was that the price of being chosen would be higher than I could ever pay. I wish I could tell you the glitter drowned out the static in my head, that the champagne and soft leather and the hush that follows power soothed whatever part of me kept asking the same question, what's the cost? But the truth is the more I stepped into Alexander's world, the more I felt someone's hand on the small of my back steering me, not guiding me, steering me. The first time I noticed it was small enough to ignore. A new phone left on my kitchen counter with a bow and a note in Alexander's handwriting, "For work and school, faster, safer, on me." I told myself it was generous. I told myself people who grew up with edges of the world sanded down thought like that, replace, upgrade, streamline. But when I powered it on, my old apps were already there, my calendar mirrored, and a background security app one didn't recognize ran like a heartbeat you can't unhear. "Our IT guy set it up," Alexander said when I asked, casual, affectionate, unbothered. "So if anything happens, I can ping your location and get you help." If anything happens. A sentence that's a promise and a threat depending on the mouth that carries it. I kissed his cheek and thanked him because that was the easiest thing to do in the moment, but that night I put the phone on airplane mode and slept with it face down, as if that could stop a thing that wanted to see. The second thing was the driver. "It's non-negotiable," he said, smiling like it was a joke, when the black SUV idled outside the cafe at 10:02 a.m., my manager peeking through the pastry case like a raccoon at a campsite. "You get off late, you're exhausted, the bus is dangerous, and frankly," he caught himself and smoothed the sentence like a wrinkle, "I worry. Let me take care of you." I said I could take care of myself. He said, I know you can. That's not the point. Let me. I hated how easy it was to give in to comfort. I hated how quickly I adjusted to doors opening for me and traffic parting like the Red Sea the moment the driver flipped a siren I didn't know private vehicles could have. Every time I took my seat in the back, my voice, the one inside, the one that was born the same year my dad left and my mother started coming home with bleach and raw hands, whispered careful, careful, careful. Then it got louder. I was in Alexander's office downtown, glass and art and air that tasted expensive, when I met Oliver, his chief of staff. Oliver had the kind of face you forget until it smiles, then you never forget it again. We're thrilled to finally meet you, he said, and it sounded like a line he'd practiced in the mirror and perfected in 1,000 tiny ways, where the eye contact lands, where the breath pauses, where warmth looks like honesty. He handed me a slender folder with my name embossed in silver. House access codes, vehicle plates, preferred restaurants, the comms sheet for security, and the standard NDA for guests on the 12th floor. Standard NDA. Guests. 12th floor. I flipped the first page and swallowed. This is a lot, I said. It's just to keep the crazies out, Alexander cut in, too quickly. Investors, paparazzi, people who think a meeting gives them license to pry. It's not about you. It's about everything else. The NDA wasn't just about not posting photos. It referenced proprietary information, sensitive partnerships, private travel manifests, internal memos. If I'd signed something like that as a barista, well, baristas don't sign things like that, do they? I slid the folder back and told them I'd take it home to read. Oliver's smile didn't falter, but I saw his knuckles whiten around his tablet. Of course, he said. Take your time. Then there were the clothes. They started showing up in garment bags with soft paper and handwritten notes. Dinner Friday, sable silk will look stunning on you. Montauk this weekend, pack light but bring the white linen. Board lunch, nothing too loud. Nothing too loud. I told myself it was a language I didn't speak yet, a choreography, etiquette, code, whatever you want to call it when money becomes culture. But the first time I wore a dress I had not chosen in a room where I did not know anyone and watched heads tilt in quiet satisfaction, as if I had solved a puzzle they set for me, I felt something fragile crack. I went home and hung the dress next to my thrift store denim jacket and watched them whisper to each other in the dark. Who are you? The jacket asked. Who are you? The dress answered back. On a Thursday in late May, my professor announced a semester-long capstone, build a brand identity for a real client. We could choose the client. Everyone wanted a startup, bright colors, friendly tone, simple deliverables. I pitched something else. I want to work with a newsroom, I said, and the room hummed. They're losing trust and attention. They need design that communicates rigor instead of volume. They need a spine. I got approval and, through a grad I knew 2 classes ahead of me, an email address at the Boston Sentinel. They didn't need student help on brand, they needed hands on their investigations desk making calls, combing filings, organizing audio, cross-referencing manifests. Unpaid, my professor warned. You have a job in classes. I'll sleep later, I said, and the thing is, I meant it. The city keeps 2 calendars, one for people who go home when office is empty, one for people who start working when the suits go to dinner. I started living on both. Mornings at the cafe, afternoons in class, evenings with Alexander, nights with public records until my eyes burned. If you're wondering why, it's because the second calendar finally gave my unease a form. Late one night I'd wandered into Alexander's study again, drawn by a map on the wall studded with brass pins connected by red thread that made a constellation only he understood. I wasn't snooping. I was looking. But I saw enough: port names, vessel IDs, a printout of a regulator's schedule tucked under a blotter, that my stomach tightened and my feet took me backward before my brain could say stop. I emailed the only person I thought might help me turn a feeling into a fact, the Sentinel contact. If someone wanted to make a problem disappear, I wrote, and that problem floated, who would they pay and how would they hide it? The reply came in minutes: coffee tomorrow, 8 a.m., no names in email. Her name, when I met her, was Mara, hair in a messy knot, eyes that measured whether I was going to waste her day. "What do you think you know?" she asked between sips of burnt diner brew. "Nothing," I said. "But I think I know where to look." So we looked. On paper, it was boring: bills of lading, port logs, emissions reports, charitable donations that lined up with inspections that got postponed, a yacht that moved like a bishop on a chessboard, diagonals that made sense only if you saw the whole game. In life, it felt like sneaking out and coming home through your own window. I wasn't paid. I didn't include Alexander in the perimeter that held me upright. I went home and looked at the NDA again, the paragraph about internal manifests, and felt the hairs rise on my arms. "Not about you," he'd said. The first real argument hit so fast we both stood in the middle of it blinking. It was over the cafe, the stupid little cafe that smelled like oranges and dish soap and had saved my life when I was 22 and lost. "Quit," he said lightly, like suggesting a movie. "Come work with me. Take the stipend Oliver mentioned, finish school, breathe." "I need tips to pay tuition this summer," I said, bristling. "I like my job." "You like being tired?" he said, smile flattening. "You like standing for 8 hours?" "I like having something that's mine." I didn't say I liked not feeling watched when I wiped down a counter or refilled someone's mug. I didn't say I liked that my manager handed me the schedule and said pick your shifts and meant it. "Everything I am offering you is yours," he said, and the gentleness in his voice made it worse. "That's the point." "Gifts aren't ownership," I said, and his jaw twitched. "Ownership is ownership." He apologized that night with takeout and a look that said he'd go to war with the world if it breathed wrong near me. I forgot how to stay angry at someone who looked at me like that. That's a thing abusers and saints have in common: both can make you forget your own edges. I'm not saying Alexander was one or the other. I'm saying I was learning that love with power inside it has to be managed or it will eat everything in the room. The next week, I left class to find a man leaning against the hallway wall reading a campus map upside down. "Ms. Miller?" he asked, eyes smiling, mouth not. "I'm Tom. Mr. Blackwood asked me to make sure you get where you're going tonight." He opened the door to the black SUV and I stared at the sky because if I didn't I was going to scream. I texted Alexander, "Call me." He replied with a heart and already on a call. "Safe, okay?" "Safe, okay." I typed, then deleted, then typed again, "I don't want a shadow." He sent back, "He's a driver, not a shadow. Humor me." That night I told Mara I couldn't meet in person. We set up a shared dock instead and she filled it with links that made my stomach do the thing it does when a car crests the top of a hill too fast. There are ways to hide toxic loads on a manifest if you misname the thing you're moving. There are ports where inspectors are always tired at the end of a month for reasons that look like college tuition and lake houses. There are gentlemen's charities that buy silence with art auctions and after parties. Do you see how the world looks different when you learn the names of its bones? Once you know a tendon exists, you see where it attaches. I started seeing a Blackwood subsidiary donating to a regional environmental nonprofit the same quarter a local board voted to modernize reporting requirements, an invitation on Alexander's desk to a weekend on a boat that was also mentioned in a thread about waste heat, a calendar entry labeled simply, HB plus M Roxbury. Henry Blackwood and Maxwell to Roxbury. Why would two men who lived at altitudes where sunlight is rationed go to my part of town without press? That's when I told Victoria. I hadn't meant to, I never meant to involve anyone in the part of my life I kept in a folder no one touched, but she found me on a balcony at a party pretending the wine was water and the city was smaller than a hand, and she did the thing no one in that house did: she asked a question and then shut up long enough to hear the answer. "You don't look dazzled," she said. "You look seasick. Do you ever feel like everyone knows a rulebook you didn't get?" I asked and she laughed so suddenly she spilled champagne on the stone. "I was born on the title page," she said, "and they still change the rules while I'm in the room." I told her small things: How Oliver's smile had teeth, how the phone worried me, how the driver hovered like a cloud that never rained. I did not tell her I was combing her father's house for clues with a journalist's hands. She nodded slowly. Alexander likes to control chaos. It's how he calms himself. The question is whether he knows when he's doing it to you. And Maxwell? I asked, braver with her than I ever was with myself. She looked back at the party, then at me. Maxwell doesn't control chaos. He manufactures it and then sells people the exits. The first night I tried to say no to the driver, Tom smiled apologetically and held the door anyway. It's my job, he said. I walked home in the rain, my shoes full of water, my phone buzzing on the seat of a car I wasn't in. Alexander was waiting at my apartment building door when I arrived, soaked, furious, scared. Do you want me dead? He said, voice too loud for the quiet street. Do you want to be a headline? Woman found in, he bit it back and shoved a hand through his hair. I can't protect you if you won't let me. I didn't ask to be protected, I said, one hand on the banister because my knees were threatening mutiny. I asked to be respected. We didn't talk for 2 days after that. He sent flowers. I put them in a jar. He sent a dress. I left it in the garment bag. He sent an apology that sounded like a CEO resigning from a board. I sent back, I need one thing that is mine. He showed up with takeout and no driver and sat on the floor with me like we were 19. Keep the job, he said softly. Keep the apartment. Keep the phone if you want and toss it in the river if you don't. Just, tell me where you are. That's all I'm asking. I don't know how to love someone and not know where she is. I believed him. I always believed him, which is either my worst quality or my best. And I did love him. God, I loved him. If you've ever tried to untangle devotion from danger, you know it doesn't separate with one yank, it resists. It clings. It knots itself tighter when you pull. The day the invitation arrived, the embossed card thick as credit and thin as threat, I was at my kitchen table with my Sentinel doc open and a spreadsheet of vessel transponders spread across my screen. The pleasure of your company is requested to celebrate the 60th anniversary of Henry and Eleanor Blackwood, it read. Formal dinner, Blackwood Estate. Alexander texted 10 seconds later like he'd been watching the mailbox. Say yes, he wrote, and I promised to run interference the entire night. I stared at the gold cursive and thought the word interference is a war word. I said yes. I bought nothing. I borrowed Sophia's dress and her pearl earrings and pressed my hand against the mirror until the girl looking back agreed to behave. That week, Mara sent me a recording. It wasn't illegal, it was sloppy. A senior manager on a conference call, forgetting to hang up, laughing about cleaning up the spill on paper, a joke about the ocean digesting secrets, someone saying Max will handle the inspector with the confidence of a man who's never met a consequence he couldn't buy lunch. I saved the file and then saved it again somewhere no one would think to look. I printed nothing. I touched nothing I didn't have to. I wore the dress and the pearls and the scent Alexander liked, the one that smells like first rain and a new book, and I told myself the word I had always told myself on nights when the stakes were too high for the girl from Millfield, Ohio, breathe. What I didn't tell anyone, not even Sophia, not even the version of myself that writes in the margins when she's too scared to say it out loud, is that I packed a second pair of shoes, a flat pair I could run in, and tucked them in my bag behind a compact and lipstick. It sounds dramatic until you've been in rooms where power turns ahead and decides who gets to leave with dignity. It sounds dramatic until you've been called a name that strips your humanity to the price of a dress. I hadn't been called it yet. But I could feel the word coming like weather. On the afternoon of the dinner, Oliver texted me a reminder, hair at 4, car at 6, arrival at 7:30, smile at always, and I nearly threw my phone across the room. Instead I put it face down and opened my laptop. There's a thing that happens when you're about to walk into a place you might not walk out of the same person, your life organizes itself without your permission. I wrote 3 emails. One to my professor, I may miss Monday. Family emergency. One to Mara, if I say go, you publish without waiting for me to say why. And one to myself, the kind of letter you write when you need to anchor to something no one can move. You are not a guest. You are not a beggar. You are not a secret they are allowing to exist for an evening. You are you, and that has always been enough. If you're waiting for me to say I didn't go, I went. If you're waiting for me to say I fought, I did. If you're waiting for me to say I was ready for everything that happened, I wasn't. No one is ready for someone else's contempt. No one is ready for a word that turns your body into a service door. But I walked into that house with a spine that belonged to my mother and a mouth that belonged to me and a file full of receipts that belonged to the truth. On the drive over, Alexander took my hand and drew circles on my palm like he was sketching a map he hoped I'd follow. Remember, he murmured, people in there will try to decide who you are before you open your mouth. You don't have to prove anything. That's the thing about rooms like this, I said, watching our reflection in the glass. If you don't prove anything, they write the proof for you. He flinched in that way he flinches when he thinks I'm about to leave and squeezed my hand. Then I'll prove you're with me. Or, I said, smiling without humor, I'll prove I'm with myself. He laughed softly. Deal. The chandelier, the marble, the hush, the glance, you've heard that part. What you haven't heard is the part where Victoria found me before the first drink hit my hand. You good? She asked, eyes scanning the room like she'd learned to count threats and exits in the same breath. Define good, I whispered. Capable of slicing someone with a sentence, she offered, and I smiled for real for the first time that night. Getting there. Good girl, she said, then winced. Sorry. Old habits. Good woman. Better, I said. She squeezed my fingers and was gone, a ghost wearing couture. I could write a book on the microaggressions that wore diamonds that night, the compliments with glass in them, the questions that were actually answers, how quaint, a barista, how novel, a public school, how brave, to wear blue in spring, but the thing that mattered wasn't the noise, it was the silence in Alexander's father's eyes when he measured me and decided I was a mess he wouldn't own. I could feel the word he hadn't said yet rustling its feathers in his throat. I took a sip of water and rehearsed a life where I didn't flinch when it flew. If you've watched this far, you already know what he called me. You already know how the air thinned and time slowed and I made a choice that snapped something and healed something else. But before the word, there was a moment so small I almost missed it. Eleanor touched my arm and whispered, if anyone makes you feel less, come sit by me. It didn't protect me from what came next. But it gave me a place to look while I was on fire. And when it was over, when the word sat between us like a stain no one wanted to clean, I didn't look at him. I looked at her. And I remembered my letter. You are not a guest. You are not a beggar. You are not a secret they are allowing to exist for an evening. You are you, and that has always been enough. So I stood. And I did not run. And everything that would happen after, the truth, the story, the fallout, the wreckage, the rebuilding, began with a calm I did not recognize as mine until I heard my own voice using it. That is where I will leave this part, because part 4 is the moment the match meets the fuse, the word meets the woman, and the woman answers with the only thing that scares men like Maxwell more than poverty, receipts. The thing about moments that break you is that they never announce themselves. They arrive in the middle of small talk and champagne bubbles, and 1 second you are nodding politely while someone tells you about their polo horses and the next second a man old enough to be your grandfather decides to reduce you to a single word. It happened like that. Henry Blackwood leaned back in his chair, his glass raised, his lips curled into the faintest approximation of a smile, and when his gaze cut across the table to me, it felt like stepping into a beam of cold light. He did not clear his throat, he did not soften his tone, he simply let the word fall into the space like ash, street garbage. For a breath I thought maybe I had misheard, maybe it was the clink of crystal, the rustle of silk, but then I saw the satisfaction in his eyes, the tiny ripple of amusement passing through the men flanking him, the deliberate silence of the women who knew better than to interrupt, and I understood that it had been waiting there all along, feathered and sharp, a word chosen for maximum efficiency, Meant to slice me open in front of everyone and leave me bleeding with no visible wound. Time slowed. I remember the way the chandelier light fractured in the water glass in front of me, the faint hiss of a candle wick guttering, the feel of Alexander's hand tightening on my knee under the table, his nails digging crescents into my skin as though his grip could keep me in place. For a heartbeat I considered what every girl raised on survival considers: smile, swallow, let it pass, don't make a scene. But then I remembered the letter I had written to myself, the anchor I had tied to my own chest. I remembered Eleanor's hand on my arm and Victoria's whisper on the balcony. And I remembered my mother, hands raw from bleach but spine straight as an oak, telling me once when I was 9, "They will try to tell you who you are. Don't you ever hand them the pen." So I stood up. The scrape of my chair against marble was louder than the insult. Every head turned, forks frozen halfway to mouths. I did not look at Henry. I looked at Alexander, and in his eyes I saw panic, fury, and something else, fear, not of me but of what I was about to unleash. He shook his head ever so slightly, a silent plea. I shook mine back. And then I spoke, my voice steady, carrying farther than I thought possible. "Street garbage," I repeated, letting the word hang there like smoke. Funny thing about garbage. You can bury it, you can burn it, but if it's toxic it always finds its way back into the soil, into the water, into the air. Garbage doesn't disappear just because powerful men want it hidden. It comes back. And it leaves a record. There was a rustle, a murmur, a sharp intake of breath. Someone coughed. Henry's smile didn't falter but his eyes narrowed, and Maxwell, leaning lazy in his chair, straightened, his wine glass lowering like a curtain falling. Alexander half rose, his lips parting with words that never came because at that exact moment my phone buzzed in my clutch. I had set the doc with Mara to publish on one signal, one simple go. And I knew that if I pressed it now, the truth we had been stitching together in the dark would ignite. I looked around the table and saw them all, men with cufflinks worth more than my apartment, women who had learned to survive by silence, servants who moved like shadows, and the ghosts of 1,000 secrets hiding in polished silver and candlelight. My thumb hovered. Alexander whispered, "Jackin, not here." But here was exactly the point. If not here, where? If not now, when? So I pressed send. The buzz of the room changed instantly, though no one yet knew why. Phones began to vibrate, screens lighting up in laps, headlines firing out into the night faster than anyone at that table could control. The investigation went live, manifests, donations, inspectors bought and paid, the audio file of a careless executive joking about poisoning oceans. Names, dates, vessels, routes, receipts carved into digital stone. The kind of story that cannot be unread once the world has seen it. Mara had kept her word. Henry's glass shattered against the floor. Maxwell swore under his breath. Oliver's phone was already at his ear, his other hand white-knuckled around a napkin. Eleanor sat very still, her face unreadable, and Victoria, God bless her, smiled the smallest, sharpest smile I had ever seen. "Do you know what you've done?" Alexander hissed at me, not with hate but with a kind of desperate awe, as if he could not decide whether to kiss me or drag me out into the night. "Yes," I said simply. "I told the truth." Silence swallowed us. And then, like thunder chasing lightning, the world outside began to roar, sirens in the distance, phones ringing off hooks, messages flooding feeds. The house that had always seemed untouchable suddenly felt porous, fragile, a fortress with cracks running through every stone. And in the center of it all I stood, not street garbage, not a beggar at their table, but Jackin, who had finally remembered that the only permission she ever needed was her own. The sound of the glass shattering still echoed in the hall when the first phones began to ring, sharp and relentless like alarm bells announcing the end of an empire, and within seconds the golden glow of the dining room seemed to dim, as though the chandeliers themselves sensed the shift. Whispers erupted, chairs scraped, men who had built entire careers on composure suddenly fumbled with screens, their faces drained of color as headlines scrolled across them faster than their eyes could follow. Some rose to their feet demanding explanations, some turned on one another, and others simply stared at me as if I had pulled a blade from nowhere and carved open the table. My chest was tight, but not with fear, no, what pulsed through me was something sharper, something cleaner, the kind of clarity that comes only after years of silence finally shattered. Alexander's hand clamped around my wrist, hard enough to bruise, his voice low but vibrating with urgency as he pulled me aside, his eyes wild in a way I had never seen before. "Do you realize what you've done?" he spat, the words trembling at the edges. I looked at him, and for the first time I didn't feel small beneath his gaze. "Yes," I whispered, steady, "I told the world the truth you were too afraid to face." He flinched as if struck, then dragged me toward the side doors, away from the eruption at the table, away from Blackwood's roar and Maxwell's frantic commands to their aides. The marble hallway seemed colder than usual, the echoes of our footsteps bouncing like accusations. Behind us chaos churned, Victoria's laughter cutting like glass, Oliver barking orders into his phone, Eleanor's steady voice urging calm while men panicked. But in that hallway it was just him and me, the mask stripped away, nothing left between us but raw fury and something else, something like heartbreak. He shoved me against the wall, his breath ragged, his hands trembling. "You don't understand," he growled, "you think you've saved something, but you've doomed us all. You've doomed me." I met his stare, and though my body trembled, my voice was stronger than I knew it could be. "Maybe you should have thought of that before you chose their side." For a moment I thought he would break, that the fire in his eyes would melt into tears, but then the steel returned and he stepped back, running a hand through his hair like a man drowning in his own choices. The noise of the party had shifted into something more dangerous, sirens outside now, faint at first but growing louder, the sound of the city turning its attention to the fortress that had always been untouchable. We could hear the gates rattling with the weight of press and protest already gathering. Alexander turned to me, softer this time, almost pleading. "You could have come to me," he said, "we could have handled this together, quietly, strategically. Do you think they'll let you walk free after this? Do you think you can just burn down an empire and stroll away untouched?" His words hung heavy, but I lifted my chin. I didn't come this far to hide again. Let them come. Then the doors to the hall burst open and one of his security men rushed toward him, murmuring urgent words I couldn't catch, but the look on Alexander's face told me enough. The empire was cracking, faster than even he expected. He glanced back at me, torn between fury and a strange, reluctant respect. For the first time I saw him not as the master of this glittering cage but as a man trapped inside it too. We returned to the dining room just as another wave of chaos hit. Phones blared with alerts, screens lit up with breaking news banners, words like corruption, toxic trade, and international scandal bleeding red across every display. Henry Blackwood stood pale and shaking, shouting about betrayal, demanding someone silence the leak, while Maxwell's face was stone, the fury in his eyes enough to silence everyone around him. Oliver slammed a fist on the table, papers scattering like broken promises. Eleanor, calm as ever, sipped her wine and murmured that perhaps it was time to consider contingency plans. And Victoria, oh, Victoria, leaned back in her chair, her eyes sparkling with something between vindication and delight. Then Blackwood turned on me, his voice cracking with rage, calling me a traitor, a parasite, a girl too stupid to understand the consequences. His spit flew, his hands shook, and for a moment I saw not power but decay, not strength but desperation. I met his rage with silence, and that silence was louder than his roar. Because he knew. They all knew. The world outside their walls already had the truth, and nothing they said could stuff it back into the shadows. Reporters were at the gates. Sirens drew nearer. The walls of the house felt like they were closing in, the empire they had built on secrecy trembling beneath the weight of exposure. And at the center of it all I stood, no longer invisible, no longer their pawn. Alexander watched me like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, uncertain if he should leap or drag me down with him. In that moment I understood, the fight was no longer about belonging at their table. The fight was about surviving the storm I had unleashed, and deciding who I would be when the dust settled. The sound of sirens grew louder until it seemed the very walls of the estate were vibrating, a chorus of wailing voices from the city that had finally turned its eyes on the fortress it once admired. And through the tall windows I could see flashes of red and blue slicing through the darkness outside, the glow of cameras like 1,000 hungry stars waiting to devour their fallen gods. Inside the dining hall, chaos had dissolved into strategy, men shouting into phones, others huddled in tight circles, their words hurried and sharp, Maxwell pacing like a general watching his battlefield collapse, and Henry still barking about betrayal, his face purple with rage, veins bulging as if he might collapse from his own fury. But none of them mattered to me in that moment because all I could see was Alexander standing across from me, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with conflict so deep it seemed to fracture him in two. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear, and in that whisper I heard both desperation and tenderness. "Jackin, you have to leave now. If you stay, they will tear you apart. They'll make you the scapegoat, the girl who lit the match. You don't know how ruthless they are." I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering. If I leave now, they'll twist the story anyway. They'll say I was nothing, or worse, that I was part of it. No, Alexander. Running has never saved me. I won't start now. His hands trembled as he reached for me but stopped just shy of touching. You think you're strong enough to weather this storm, but you don't know the kind of storm it is. This isn't gossip at a diner, Jackin. These are men who crush nations, who bury cities. They will bury you without a second thought. His voice cracked on the last words, and for the first time since I had met him I heard fear not for himself but for me. I looked past him to the windows where the press shouted, their voices muffled but relentless, calling my name though they didn't even know my face yet, calling his name with venom, calling Blackwood's name with fury. The world outside was no longer passive, it was awake, hungry, furious. I drew a breath and whispered, "Then let them bury me. At least the truth will be carved on my grave." Alexander's eyes closed as if the words physically struck him, and when he opened them again something had changed. The fury was still there, but it was tempered by resignation, by a strange kind of admiration. "You're going to destroy me," he said softly. "No," I replied, steady, "I'm going to destroy the chains you wrapped yourself in. What you do without them is your choice." At that moment the heavy front doors burst open and shouts filled the hall, security clashing with police, reporters forcing microphones past barriers, the air electric with the scent of panic and inevitability. Maxwell shouted for control, Blackwood demanded arrests, Eleanor calmly suggested lawyers, and Victoria simply lit a cigarette and leaned back as though enjoying the spectacle of Rome burning. Oliver tried to corral Alexander, urging him to cut ties with me immediately, to sacrifice me as proof of his loyalty to the family. His words were sharp, his eyes darting toward me like daggers. "She's nothing, Alexander. Let her go. Save yourself." The room fell silent, every eye on him, waiting to see which way the scales would tip. My heart thudded, my throat dry, but I held his gaze without flinching. This was the moment. Either I would be thrown to the wolves to protect their empire, or I would walk out as the woman who broke their silence. His lips parted, his jaw clenched, and then, against every expectation in the room, he said, "No. She is not nothing. She's the only one here who remembered what truth looks like." Gasps rippled through the hall, Maxwell's eyes narrowing, Henry sputtering with rage, Oliver nearly collapsing in disbelief. And then Alexander turned to me, his voice firm now, a choice made. "Jackin, go. I'll hold them long enough for you to leave. Don't argue. Just go." My knees felt weak, my chest heavy, but I nodded because there was no other way. He was giving me a chance, even if it meant severing himself from everything he had built. As I walked toward the side door the world seemed to tilt, the weight of 1,000 stairs pressing against my back, the sound of shouts outside growing louder, the flash of cameras searing through the glass. I pushed the door open and the night air hit me like a wave, cold and bracing, filled with the roar of the crowd. Reporters surged forward, questions flying like arrows, lights blinding, microphones thrust toward me. For a heartbeat I froze, a deer in headlights, but then I remembered the letter, remembered my mother's voice, remembered that I had chosen this. I lifted my chin and kept walking, every step carrying me out of their fortress and into the storm, into a world where I would no longer hide. Behind me I could still hear Alexander's voice shouting orders, trying to hold the crumbling house together, his loyalty torn in two directions. And I knew this was only the beginning, because the truth was out, but survival was another battle entirely. The night outside was a storm of voices, lights, and questions that clawed at me the second I stepped onto the marble steps of the Blackwood estate, the gate barely holding back the sea of cameras and flashing bulbs that pulsed like lightning in the darkness. Microphones shot forward like spears, each reporter shouting louder than the last, a chaos of accusations and demands. Jackin, who paid you? Are you Alexander's mistress? Did you leak the files yourself? Are you part of the corruption? And all I could do was keep walking, my pulse pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The security men tried to push back the crowd, but the wall of bodies surged, and for a terrifying moment I thought I might be swallowed whole, crushed beneath the weight of a world that suddenly knew my name without knowing anything about me. I lifted my chin, blinking through the blinding lights, and forced my voice to steady even though my throat was dry as ash. The truth is out there now, I said, my words barely cutting through the roar. I am not the story. What they did, what they tried to hide, that's the story. My words hung fragile in the air, nearly drowned by the cacophony, but I saw them ripple through the crowd, some reporters freezing for a second as if they hadn't expected me to speak at all. Questions redoubled, fiercer now, but in that instant I realized something vital. They weren't just hungry for blood, they were hungry for clarity, for something real in the midst of scandal spun by powerful men. I kept moving, one step at a time down the grand staircase, my shadow stretching long in the glare of floodlights. Somewhere behind me I heard Alexander's voice faint through the walls, shouting over his uncles, over Maxwell's growl and Henry's venom, and the thought of him trapped in that pit of wolves made my stomach twist. But I couldn't go back. If I turned now, everything would collapse on top of me. So I walked, pushing through the crowd, the cameras chasing like predators but also bearing witness. The city itself seemed alive with the revelation. On the giant screens in the square, headlines scrolled in urgent red: Blackwood Empire under fire, secret files leaked, questions mount over toxic trade. People on the street stopped, pointing, their faces caught between awe and fury, whispers spreading faster than wildfire. I heard someone shout my name not as an insult but as a rallying cry, and suddenly it wasn't just reporters but ordinary citizens pressing closer, some yelling "Tell us more," and others "Thank you." The weight of it nearly buckled me, gratitude mixed with suspicion, hope tangled with hate. I stumbled into a waiting car Mara had somehow arranged, the door slammed, and at once the outside noise dulled to a muffled roar. My hand shook as I tried to catch my breath, but Mara, calm and unflinching, reached from the front seat to squeeze my arm. "You did it," she said. "The story is everywhere. They can't bury it now." I looked at her, my chest tight, and whispered, "But can I survive it?" She didn't answer, only started the engine, weaving us through streets alive with sirens and shouts. Meanwhile, inside the estate, I knew Alexander was facing the cost of his choice. The family would never forgive him for refusing to cast me aside. They would strip him, break him, crush him if they could, because in their eyes I wasn't just a girl from nowhere, I was the weakness that made their fortress fall. I imagined him standing there in that glittering cage, trying to hold his ground as Maxwell demanded obedience, as Henry screamed for blood, as Oliver whispered poison in every ear. And I wondered if, in choosing to let me go, he had already lost everything. But outside, in the city that had been kept in the dark for too long, the tide was turning. People gathered in streets, voices rising, anger mounting. They weren't just angry at Blackwood, they were angry at the whole machine that had let power choke them for decades. My face flashed on screens alongside Alexander's, alongside the documents, alongside names of ships and officials and money trails that could no longer be denied. For better or worse, I had become the symbol of the crack in the empire. As the car carried me away from the estate, I pressed my forehead to the glass, watching the blur of neon and faces rushing past, and I whispered to myself words I had almost forgotten: "This is who you are, Jackin. Not garbage, not a shadow. A voice." And though fear twisted in my gut, there was fire there too, fire that would not be snuffed out even if the whole world tried. The city was no longer the same city I had walked through 1,000 times before. It was louder, heavier, alive with voices and screens replaying my face and my name as if I had become both a warning and a beacon overnight. and as Mara steered the car through side streets lit with neon and protest fires, I realized that hiding would be impossible because the story had already made me the center of a storm I never asked to be in. At every corner, groups of people gathered around glowing phones, gasping, shouting, arguing, some with anger in their eyes and others with hope, and my chest ached at the realization that truth was never clean. It cut both ways, it freed and it burned. Mara parked in a nondescript garage and led me into a cramped apartment above a laundromat, its single window rattling from the noise of the street, and she pressed a steaming cup of tea into my trembling hands, her voice calm and steady in contrast to the chaos outside. "You have to decide what happens next, Jackin. Right now you are the girl who lit the fire, but fires either consume everything or they guide people through darkness. Which one will you be?" Her words settled heavy inside me, because I had never thought of myself as anything more than a survivor, never as a guide, but the choice was suddenly mine. While I sat there breathing steam and fear, the empire inside the Blackwood estate was fracturing. I could picture it in my mind, Maxwell shouting orders, demanding strategies to contain the leak, Henry still red-faced with rage calling me a snake, Oliver twisting words to poison Alexander's name in the ears of those still undecided. Eleanor, calm but sharp, would be the one to say what others wouldn't, that Alexander's refusal to cut me off had marked him, that in the eyes of the family he was no longer one of them but a liability. And Alexander, standing tall though I knew his chest must feel as though it were caving in, holding his ground as their voices circled him like vultures. Reports later would confirm what I sensed even then. They stripped him of authority over key accounts, reassigned allies, began dismantling his influence piece by piece. He had chosen me over them and now he was paying the price in real time. Meanwhile Mara worked tirelessly, sending files to journalists she trusted, arranging interviews, preparing a narrative to counter the lies already spreading like wildfire. "They'll paint you as unstable, as emotional, as nothing more than a bitter girl scorned," she warned me. "We have to get ahead of it. We have to give them your truth before theirs takes root." My stomach clenched at the thought of speaking into cameras, of baring my voice to a world that had only ever known me through other people's words, but I nodded because silence was no longer an option. The first interview was in a basement studio with peeling paint and buzzing fluorescent lights, nothing glamorous, just a small team of independent journalists who looked at me not with judgment but with an urgency that mirrored my own. I told them about the files, about the voices of women and men silenced by power, about the children sickened by poisoned waters while ships carried profit across oceans. My voice shook at first, but the more I spoke the steadier it became, and when I finished the room was silent except for the hum of the recorder. "This isn't just my story," I said, my hands gripping the edge of the table. "This is everyone's story who has ever been told they don't matter, that they don't belong. The truth matters. Even if it costs me everything." When the interview aired online, it spread faster than I could breathe. Messages poured in, some thanking me, some threatening me, but all proof that the world was listening. I watched from the tiny laundromat apartment as my own words echoed back at me through millions of screens, and I felt something stir inside me, not pride, not yet, but a sense of finally stepping into the light after years of shadow. But shadows remained, because the Blackwoods did not surrender easily. Rumors surfaced of them plotting lawsuits, of private investigators hunting me, of money moving quietly to buy silence. I felt eyes on me every time I stepped near a window, and Mara insisted on moving me from place to place, always one step ahead of men in suits who asked too many questions. Nights were restless, filled with the hum of the city and the weight of wondering if Alexander was still fighting or if he had already been consumed. One night Mara tossed a paper onto the table, the headline screaming about Alexander's removal from the board, about whispers that he had betrayed the family. My throat tightened as I traced his name with my fingertip, imagining him alone in that cavernous estate, stripped of everything except his choice to protect me. The article claimed he had vanished from the public eye, no longer attending meetings, his usual allies distant. For the first time since I met him, I wondered if I had not just broken chains but also broken him. Yet beneath the fear, beneath the guilt, there was a spark of defiance. I thought of my mother again, of the letter, of the little girl who swore she would never let them write her story for her. And I knew that as much as they wanted me to vanish, I had to keep speaking, keep moving, keep living. Because survival wasn't just about breathing, it was about refusing to be erased. So I leaned into the storm, and with each word I spoke to the world, with each truth I released, I felt the fire inside me steady, less like destruction and more like light. The days that followed unfolded like two parallel storms, one raging inside the collapsing halls of the Blackwood Empire and the other spilling into the streets of the city where my name was whispered on every corner, and though I no longer stood beside Alexander I felt his shadow at every turn, as though we were tied by an invisible thread stretched taut across the widening distance. News outlets reported his fall in merciless detail, showing grainy photographs of him leaving meetings alone, his once loyal allies scattering like birds sensing a predator, his seat at the board stripped from him in a vote that took less than an hour. Maxwell's iron grip tightened, Henry's furious rants grew more venomous, Oliver's poisonous whispers reached every ear willing to listen, and Eleanor, calm as ever, smoothed over the fractures by quietly removing Alexander from decisions that once depended on him. To the world he was no longer a prince of power but a traitor to his bloodline, a man who had chosen a woman over an empire. I watched it all from the laundromat apartment, the flicker of the old TV casting blue light on peeling walls, my heart twisting each time his name scrolled across the ticker. I wondered if he hated me now, if in the dark hours he blamed me for everything he had lost, but then I remembered the way he looked at me in that hallway, the tremor in his voice when he told me to run, and I clung to that memory as proof that he had made his choice freely. Still the guilt gnawed at me, because every headline that called him a fallen heir felt like another stone tied to my ribs. Meanwhile my own storm was no gentler. Mara pushed me into interviews, into statements, into the endless carousel of telling and retelling my story so it could not be twisted out of shape, and though each time I spoke my voice grew stronger the toll was heavy. Hate mail poured in, threats scribbled in red ink, photos of my face defaced and posted online. People screamed my name in the street, some in gratitude, others in fury. I had become both symbol and scapegoat, and there were nights I lay awake wondering if I had simply traded one cage for another, but then there were moments, small but fierce, that reminded me why I could not stop. A letter slipped under the laundromat door from a mother who said her child had been sick for years because of the very toxins hidden in those files, her words thanking me for giving them hope. A young man stopping me on the street, trembling as he said his father had worked for the Blackwoods and died without ever daring to speak of what he knew. Their eyes, their gratitude, were like fuel for the fire I carried, the fire that sometimes threatened to burn me from the inside but also kept me moving when fear clawed at my throat. In the quiet hours, though, I thought of Alexander. I pictured him alone in the cavernous mansion, stripped of power but still carrying the weight of his family's wrath, and I wondered if he regretted everything, if he sat in silence hating the girl who had dragged him into ruin. And yet sometimes, late at night when the city quieted and only the hum of traffic drifted through the thin walls, I swore I could almost hear his voice, not in reality but in memory, whispering that I had done what he could not. It was enough to make me ache, enough to make me hope that one day we would not be enemies forged by circumstance but allies shaped by survival. The world outside did not slow. Protests grew louder, investigations deeper, politicians distanced themselves from the family that once bankrolled them. The empire was bleeding, its pillars cracking. And still I spoke, still I faced the cameras, still I walked streets where strangers either spat at my feet or reached to touch my hand as though I carried their salvation. It was exhausting, exhilarating, terrifying, all at once, and through it all, the invisible thread remained. No matter how far the storms pulled us apart, I knew that somewhere within the ruins of his world Alexander was still thinking of me, and I was still thinking of him. Two lives forever altered by one night, two voices that had chosen truth over silence even if it cost us everything. The weeks turned into months, and though the frenzy of headlines began to dull into the steady drumbeat of politics and legal battles, the echoes of that night never left me, the night I walked out of the Blackwood estate and chose truth over silence, a choice that marked me forever and marked Alexander too. And in the quiet moments when the noise of the world faded I would sit by the window of whatever safe apartment Mara had found for us and watch the city breathe, its towers rising like questions against the sky, and I would wonder whether he was watching the same sky from somewhere in the shadows of his fallen empire. The Blackwoods were not destroyed in a single blow, but they were fractured beyond repair, their empire slowly eroded by investigations, lawsuits, and the desertion of those who once bowed at their table. and though Maxwell still barked orders and Henry still raged, the foundation had been cracked and nothing could erase that. Alexander disappeared from public view entirely, no more photographs, no more headlines, only rumors that he had left the estate and retreated to some quiet corner of the world where the weight of his last name could no longer reach him. Some said he had been cast out, others that he had left by choice, but I knew in my heart that wherever he was he carried the scar of that night just as I carried mine. For me life became both smaller and larger at once. Smaller because I lived simply, always looking over my shoulder, always aware that power does not forgive betrayal, but larger because I carried voices now, voices that had been silenced for years, voices that spoke through me every time I faced a camera or stood before a crowd. I was no longer just Jackin, the girl dismissed, the girl overlooked. I was Jackin who spoke when silence was demanded, Jackin who endured the storm. It was not a title I wanted, but it was one I refused to abandon, because if my suffering, my fear, my exile could carve even a small path for truth to walk, then it was worth it. There were nights I dreamed of him. Alexander standing at the end of a long corridor, his eyes both proud and broken, his hand reaching but never quite touching mine. In those dreams I always whispered the same words, we did what they could not. We chose. And I would wake with tears on my face, torn between gratitude for his choice and sorrow for what it cost him. Yet I knew this was the price of freedom, that no one walks away from empires unscarred. The world moved on, as it always does. New scandals replaced old ones, new faces rose while others fell. But every so often I would see my name still flicker across a screen, tied to words like whistleblower, survivor, symbol. And every so often someone would stop me on the street, take my hand, and tell me that because of what I did they dared to speak, or to fight, or simply to believe that truth mattered. And in those moments I knew that even if I never saw Alexander again, even if the world remembered me only as a girl who disrupted an empire, that was enough, because this was never about me alone. It was about the choice to stand when silence was easier, to burn when hiding was safer, to live not as a shadow but as a voice. And though the storm had nearly broken me, it had also remade me, and I carried that fire forward into whatever future awaited. So here I am, telling you my story, not as a confession but as a reminder that truth is never tidy, it is messy and painful and costly, but it is also the only thing that can set us free. And now I turn to you, listening on the other side of this screen. What would you have done if you were in my place, standing in that room, holding the weight of secrets that could topple everything? Would you have spoken, or would you have stayed silent? Tell me in the comments, because I want to know how you would face the storm, and maybe together we can remember that even the smallest voice can change the world.